Today I am going to continue our previous lecture with the topic of hypothesis testing. In our previous lecture, we were discussed about the epidemiological studies. Today we are going to discuss about the hypothesis testing. Another concept of the epidemiological method is hypothesis testing. Its importance to the experimental process cannot be overstated. In planning an experimental trial, the investigator identifies a cause-effect comparison to be tested as the research hypothesis. Hypothesis is a testing in statistics is a way for you to test the result of a survey or experiment to see if you have a meaningful results. For example, a study might be designed to determine whether a vaccine for hepatitis A is effective among children or whether a protein in cow's milk is responsible for triggering the type 1 diabetes mellitus. In a community-based nutrition study, one hypothesis might be status such as I will give you one example. There will be a significant decrease in the calories from saturated fat and an increase in the grams of fiber consumed by employees in the 8 intervention work sites receiving the nutrition programming compared with employees in the 8 control work sites. Once the specific research question, which is the hypothesis, commonly known as hypothesis research question, is a hypothesis, has been formulated, the investigators design a study to obtain the information that will enable them to make the inferences about the original hypothesis. In some epidemiological studies, not all hypotheses are specified at the beginning. Rather, one or more hypotheses are generated retrospectively. After the research data have been collected and analyzed. The temptation to do this is compelling. A typical epidemiologic study produces the reams of data about the individuals, such as age, gender, race, what will be the educational level, occupation of the population, and specific agents. What type of these specific agents are used, such as diet, vitamins, tobacco, alcohol, pesticides, and drugs, and outcomes. What will be the outcomes, such as death, heart attack, colon cancer, impairment of renal functions. When the data are downloaded into a computer for the statistical analysis, the investigator may consider the data, searching for statistical association among the various groups that may suggest a cause-effect relationship. This activity, called data tracking, is worth avoiding. The statement of a clear, precise hypothesis at the beginning of the study ensures that the appropriate data are collected to answer the research question and helps avoid the pitfall of drawing spurious conclusions from the dataset. Cause and effect relationship is a relationship between the events and things, where one is the result of another. This is the combination of action and reactions. Sometimes something happens that is a cause that leads to an effect. For boosting your understanding of this important concept by reviewing the some key cause and effect example. When you are trying to understand what is cause and effect, it can be very helpful to review the some examples. I will give you some examples. He broke his arm. It's a cause. And its effect is the doctor put his arm in a cast. I never brush my teeth. It's a cause. And what will be the effect of this cause? I have 5 cavities. I never brush my teeth is a cause, and its effect is I have 5 cavities. I will give you another example. I have smoked cigarettes daily for 20 years, and its effect is I have lung cancer. Understand? Most research generates new questions, not final answers. The sequence begins anew and research continues in a somewhat cyclic way. Always started with the observation in question and end with the new observation and new questions. And important aspect of the epidemiological method. Scientific method is determining whether the data are valid. Research data can have 3 possible explanations. First one is the bias, second one is the chance, and third one is the truth. The observation is incorrect because a systematic error was introduced by the selection bias, measurement bias, and confounding bias. Selection bias is the method by which patients or study subjects were selected for the observations. And measurement bias is the method by which the observation or measurement was made. And confounding bias is the presence of an other variable that accounts for the observation. And second factor was the chance. The observation is incorrect because of the error arising from the random variation. Truth is the observation is correct. This explanation should be accepted only after the other have been excluded. I will give you another example. A study was designed to determine whether a worksite sponsored physical activity program resulting in a lower percentage of body fat and lower blood lipids among the overweight adults implies in 2 companies were invited to enroll in the 3-month program. Those who agreed to participate underwent several clinical measurements at the beginning and end of the study: height, weight, skin folds, and total blood cholesterol. 156 employees who participated in the physical activity program showed a reduction in the percentage of body fat and total blood cholesterol compared with 210 adults who did not participate. One possible explanation for these results in the data are incorrect because they are biased. In other words, a systematic error was made in measuring one or more outcome variables, or there were systematic differences in the population studies. There are probably dozens of the possible biases. Most fall into one of the 3 categories listed. More than one bias may operate at one time. Selection bias may have occurred because the study participants were self-selected. In other words, employees who were interested in improving their fitness level or losing the weight were more inclined to join the program than those who were less interested in improvements in the fitness or weight loss. Measurement bias may have occurred if the technician responsible for obtaining the skin-fold measurements was an enthusiastic supporter of vigorous exercise and took more pains to make careful measurements in the exercising adults than in the sedentary adults. Confounding bias may have existed because the study focused on physical activity as the sole determinants of changes in the total blood cholesterol and body fat. It is possible that employees entering the physical activity program made significant but unconsciously alterations in their eating patterns that contribute to the changes in the blood lipids and body compositions. The presence of unmeasured or unidentified factors, which is the confounding factors, may have influenced the study outcomes. Another possible explanation for the result is that they are due simply to chance and do not represent the true state of affairs. That the observations made on these employees arose from random variations within the sample. Many factors could have contributed to the differences between the groups, including the manner in which the laboratory measurements were made and differences in the makeup of the workspace. Random variations cannot be totally eliminated and usually occurs in tandem with some form of bias. The final possible explanation for the result is that they represent the truth. Participating in a physical activity program resulted in reductions in body fat and total blood cholesterol among the employees in the two companies. To say that the data are valid means that they are neither biased nor incorrected due to the chance and that they represent the true state of affairs regarding the physiologic effects of physical activity. When a nutritional problem is suspected, an investigation is undertaken to find out something. The hypothesis to be tested is defined, the population to be studied is selected. Measurements are taken or cases are counted, and the data are analyzed to determine whether the established facts support the hypothesis. The type of investigation depends to a large extent on the research question being asked and the type of the data needed to answer the question. The major type of nutritional epidemiological studies are include first study type of studies observational studies examines the cause, preventions and treatments for the studies. Investigator passively observes as nature takes its course. Observational study is used to answer a research question based purely on what the researcher observes. There is no interferences or manipulation of the research subjects and no control and treatment groups. These type of these studies are often qualitative in nature and can be used for both exploratory and explanatory research purposes. While quantitative observational studies exist, they are less common. Observational studies are generally used in hard sciences, medical, and social science fields. This is used due to ethical or practical concerns that prevent the researchers from conducting a traditional experiment. Lack of control and treatment groups means that forming inferences is difficult, and there is a risk of confounding variable impact your analysis. Case control study is a type of observational analytic study. Involves identifying the patients who have the outcome of cases and matching them with individuals who have similar characteristics but do not have the outcome of interest. Characteristics such as previous exposure to a factor, that is a hypothesized causal or contributing factor, are then compared between cases and control. Case control study is a type of the study that compares the patient who have a disease or outcome of interest with patients who do not have the disease or outcome, and looks back retrospectively to compare how frequently the exposure to a risk factor is present in each group to determine the relationship between the risk factors and the disease. Case control studies are observational because no intervention is attempted and no attempt is made to alter the course of the disease. The goal is to retrospectively determine the exposure to the risk factor of interest from each of the two groups of individual cases and control. These studies are designed to estimate odd. Case control studies are also known as retrospective studies and case referent studies. These studies are good for studying the rare condition or diseases. Less time needed to conduct the study because condition or disease has already occurred. Useful as initial studies to establish an association. Next type of the study is cohort studies. These are the powerful tools for conducting the research in human population. They are the type of longitudinal study design. Longitudinal studies follow the participants over a period of time. People in cohort studies typically share some characteristics such as their location, their age. When people join a cohort study, the researchers gather the data about them to get a more detailed picture of the group they are studying. Researchers ask the questions to find out the demographic or characteristics such as age and race of the group. They may also gather the information about social factors, physiological factors, medical, environmental, genetics, and biological factors. This information forms the baseline for the study. Collect the data from the different points in the participants' lives. This is known as the follow-up period. The follow-up period could be weeks, months, or year. By comparing the data from the follow-up points to the baseline, researcher can see how differently factors have affected the group members' health. For example, in epidemiology, which is the study of the diseases, scientists used the cohort studies to identify the potential risk factors that drive the disease or influence the disease patterns. Cohort studies are also good at finding the relationship between the health and environmental factors such as chemicals in air, water, and food. It is a type of the observational study that can be retrospective or prospective in nature. Enrollment in the study is based on exposure characteristics such as past exposure to the risk factor or on membership in a group. Disease, death, other health related outcomes are then determined and compared. Comparison groups can be defined at the beginning or created later using data from the studies. For example, age group, smokers, non-smokers, amount of specific food group consumed. There are two types of cohort studies. First one is the prospective cohort studies and other is the retrospective cohort studies. Prospective cohort studies involve recruiting a group of participants and following them over time to gather new data. Retrospective studies involve using the pre-existing data. From a prospective cohort study, researchers identify a topic they want to study. They then design the study and recruit the participants that will best help them study the topic. For example, if they wanted to study the rates of heart disease in older ages, they would choose an age group of younger adults with similar characteristics who do not have the heart studies to use as their baselines. In a retrospective cohort studies, researchers analyze a group of people who already have certain characteristics. They then looking at existing data to jump back in time. For example, they might look at a group of older adults with the heart diseases. Then they would analyze the data about the group members' medical history to see what factors could have contributed. Prospective cohort studies enroll individuals and then collect the data at many intervals. But in retrospective cohort studies, use an existing longitudinal dataset to look back for a temporal relationship between exposure factors and outcome development. Study. In cross-sectional study, it is a type of research design in which you collect the data from many different individuals at a single point in time. In cross-sectional research, you observe the variables without influencing them. Economics, psychology, medicine, epidemiology, and the other social sciences all make use of cross-sectional studies. Epidemiologists who are interested in the current prevalence of the disease in a certain subset of the population might use a cross-section design together and analyze the relevant data. When you want to examine the prevalence of some outcome at a certain moment in time, a cross-section study is the best choice. Sometimes a cross-section study is the best choice for practical reasons. If you only have the time or money to collect cross-sectional data, or if the only data you can find to answer your research question was gathered at a single point in time. As cross-sectional studies are cheaper and less time consuming than many other types of study, they allow you to easily collect the data that can be used as a basis for further researches. It is a study where exposure factors such as individual or environmental risk factors, nutrition education, and outcomes, that is, disease occurrence, eating behaviors, are observed or measured at one point in time in a sample from the population of interest, usually by survey or interview. In this design, a researcher examines the association among factors and outcomes using a statistical test for association, but cannot infer cause and effect. Gather the data from a particular population characterized by a specific variable such as education level. In this type of study in which the same or similar data about the exposures and outcomes are collected from the same population many times, but each time a different sample is used. A trend study is like a series of cross-section studies. And other type of study is correlational studies, also known as ecological study. Ecological study focuses on groups of people rather than individuals and examines the relationship between exposure and disease with population level rather than individual level. This can also be used as the first step in exploring the relationship between an exposure and a disease. Example is coronary heart diseases in 7 countries study. In experimental study, examines preventions and treatments for diseases. Investigator actively manipulates which groups receives the agent under study. And in randomized controlled trial, individuals meeting the eligibility requirements are randomly assigned into an experimental groups or a control group. The experimental intervention, such as a protocol, method, or treatment, and its alternatives are clearly defined, and their implementation is closely managed by the researcher. An example of the randomized control trial is the dietary approaches to stop the hypertension study. An experimental study in which intact communities are the units of randomization is known as community trial and community intervention study, used to evaluate interventions that are more naturally administered at the community level. And in non-randomized control trial, where subjects are assigned to intervention alternatives by a method that is not random. Researcher does define and manage the alternatives, which could be treatment and control, or 2 or more different interventions, and provides specific knowledge to nutritional sciences. It provides data about the diet-disease relationships that is transformed by the public health nutrition into the practice of prevention. Specific contributions of nutritional epidemiology include dietary assessment, descriptions of nutritional exposure, and statistical modeling of the diet-disease relationship. Dietary assessment is moving away from the food frequency question as main dietary assessment instrument in large-scale epidemiological studies towards the use of short-term quantitative instruments due to the potential of gross measurement errors. Web-based instruments for self-administrations are evolved of being able to replace the costly interviewer conducted 24-hour reports. Much interest is also directed towards the technique of taking and analyzing the photographs of all meals ingested, which might improve the dietary assessment in terms of precision. The description of nutritional exposure could greatly benefit from standardization of the coding of the food across studies in order to improve the comparability. Statistical modeling of the dietary data and the diet-disease relationships can refer to complex programs that convert quantitative short-term measurements into habitual intakes of individuals and correct for the errors in the estimate of the diet-disease relationships by taking the data from validation studies with biomarkers into the accounts. More attention should also be put on the investigation of non-linear relationships. The increasing complexity of the conduct and analysis of nutritional epidemiological studies is calling for a distinct and advanced training programs for the young scientists moving into the area. This will also guarantee that in the future an increasing number of the high-level manuscripts will show up in this and other journals in respect of the nutritional epidemiological topics. Nutrition epidemiological methods lends itself to the study of the relationship of diet to health and disease. One of the first applications of epidemiology to nutrition science was James Lind's controlled trial investigating the curative effect of citrus fruits among sailors with scurvy. Like Snow's proposed interventions to control the cholera epidemics, Lind's suggestions that sea vessels carry a supply of limes, oranges, and other citrus fruits to prevent the scurvy came 150 years before. Researchers proved in the laboratory that scurvy results from the dietary deficiency. Similar investigation into the health effects of the vitamin C and the other 40 odd essential nutrients are being conducted. Epidemiology has other applications in the nutrition arena. It can also be used to monitor and describe the food consumption, nutrient intake, and nutrition status of the population, or specific subgroups of a population. The information obtained from the larger population surveys is then used to develop specific programs and services for the groups whose nutrition status appears to be compromised. epidemiologic methods can be used to evaluate the nutrition interventions. This usually involves monitoring the nutrition and health status of a high-risk group of individuals for a period of several months or even years. Nutrition epidemiology is a fairly new area of study, whereas its focus was once the deficiency disease such as scurvy, beriberi, and diabetes. Today, it is primarily concerned with the major chronic diseases of the so-called Western world. Chronic diseases including cardiovascular diseases, diabetes, obesity, cancer, and respiratory diseases are now the leading cause of death and disability worldwide, even in our country, in our homeland, Pakistan, accounting for 60% of deaths annually worldwide by this chronic diseases. Unlike nutritional deficiency states, chronic diseases tend to have many, sometimes interrelated causes. Relatively few risk factors such as high cholesterol, high blood pressure, obesity, physical inactivity, insufficient consumptions of fruits and vegetables, smoking, and alcohol use play a key role in the development of chronic diseases. Epidemiologic evidence suggests that a change in dietary habits and physical activity can substantially influence several of these risk factors. I will tell you in another words, nutritional epidemiology examines dietary and nutritional factors in relation to disease occurrence at a population level. Nutrition epidemiology is a new field of medical research that studies the relationship between the nutrition and health. In epidemiology, that is continuing to grow in relevance to present daily health concerns. Diet and physical activity are difficult to measure accurately, which may partially explain why nutrition has received less attention than other risk factors for diseases in epidemiology. Nutritional epidemiology uses the knowledge from nutritional sciences to aid in the understanding of human nutrition and the explanation of basic underlying mechanisms. Nutritional science information is also used in the development of nutritional epidemiological studies and interventions, including clinical, case control, and cohort studies. Nutritional epidemiological methods have been developed to study the relationship between the disease and diet. Findings from these studies impact public health as they guide the development of dietary recommendations, including those tailored specifically for the prevention of certain diseases, conditions, and cancers. Nutritional epidemiology should be a core component in the training of the health and social service professions because of its increasing relevance and past successes in improving the health of the public worldwide. Nutritional epidemiological studies reveal the relationship between nutrition and health, with a focus on etiology of chronic diseases. This will provide a view of the way in which diet affects or maintains the health and well-being in individuals and populations. Nutritional epidemiological studies are required to establish a relationship, definitive relationship between the diet and disease, to able to develop the interventions and policies that will be implemented for the health of the public. There are observational investigations and experimental investigations which have applicable study designs that fall under them, such as ecological, cross-sectional, case control, cohort studies, clinical and community trials. Control of assigning exposure, whereas in observational studies, exposures are observed only with no intervention. Experimental studies provide the stronger evidence for the effect of exposure on outcome, but observational studies are simpler to carry out and more cost effective. Observational studies are able to detect unusual things over a long period of time. In nutritional epidemiology, experimental studies may be used to draw the causal conclusion between dietary exposures and health outcomes. Nutritional policy and procedure decisions are guided by the findings from the combination of sources to ensure the accuracy, reliability, and validity. Measure of exposure is dependent on the question and also the study design. It also can be objectively and subjectively measured on individuals or populations in the past or now in the present. In nutritional epidemiological studies, factors such as food, including the nutrients and non-nutrients, and social environment. The effect of these exposures is measured as outcome. In nutritional epidemiological, the outcome is commonly referred as the disease state or the anthropometric or physiological state under continuous or discrete variables. Objective, basic objective of nutritional epidemiological research is to provide the scientific evidence to support an understanding of the role of nutrition on the causes and prevention of the health. It is very important to address the factors that affect the food supply, including quality, quantity, and balance, and the factors that affect the food after consumption. The development of a specific visible and a relevant aim of the study and target population is the first step in any type of epidemiological research. The second step is the selection and correct use of the method that measures the exposure and outcome, followed by the extensive analysis. One challenge to the study of a relationship of diet to the disease is the complexity of our diets. The foods we consume each day are complex mixtures of chemicals, some of which are known to be very important to the human health, and some of which have not even been identified or even measured. Chemicals found in all our foods include the essential nutrients, structural compounds such as cellulose, additives, pesticides, inorganic compounds such as natural toxins, heavy metals, or natural compounds such as phytochemicals. The diversity of the chemicals found in the foodstuff creates the problem for investigators, studying the relationship of diet to the disease processes. When assessing the relationship of vitamin A intake to the development of lung cancer, for example, an investigator must calculate the population's intake of compounds with vitamin A activity, that is, reformed vitamin A, retinoic acid, other forms of the vitamin A, and the carotenoids. Not only must the intake of these compounds from food be considered, but also the intake from the vitamin supplements and other sources, if they exist. Post-epidemiological investigations, it is the long-term dietary intake of foodstuffs that is important. In the case of the disease such as lung cancer, which may take 10 to 20 years to develop, the lifelong intake of vitamin A must be estimated. And other difficulties that people do not eat the same food every day. Work and school schedules, illnesses, holidays, weekends, seasons of the years, personal preferences, availability of the food, social and cultural norms, and numerous other factors. All these factors influences our daily food choices. As a result, our nutrient intake varies from day to day. The magnitude of the variations differ with the nutrients. A study was conducted to determine the number of days of food intake records needed to estimate the true average nutrient intake of a small number of adults. 29 men and women participating in the study completed detailed food records for 365 consecutive days. Range of days and the average number of days of food records required to estimate the true average intake for individuals. Then you will be noted that in this table, gender differences in the average value. For example, more food records were needed to estimate the true average intake of calories by women than by men. There were differences between the nutrients. Compare the average value for calories with those for the vitamin A and C, sodium, fat. Finally, the wide range in food records necessary to estimate true intakes. For a reliable estimate of the vitamin A intake, 115 days of food records were required for some men, whereas 17, 20, 24 days, nearly 5 years, were required for others. These data demonstrate a relatively large number of days of food intake records are needed to achieve a certain level of statistical significance for an individual. If the individual data are combined into groups, few days of food intake records are required. Day-to-day variation in an individual's nutrient intake, also called the within-person variation, has important implications for nutritional epidemiological studies. If only one day's intake is determined, then the true long-term nutrient intake must be misrepresented. For example, an individual whose vitamin C intake over a period of several days is in fact adequate may be classified as having a low vitamin C intake. The effects of within person variations on dietary intake must be considered while designing and evaluating the studies of the relationship of diet to disease. Primary method of assessing the available food supply at the national level is based on food balance sheets. Food balance sheet do not measure the food actually ingested by a population. They measure the food available for consumption from imports and domestic food production, less the food lost through exports, waste or spoilage on a per capita basis. The per capita figures are obtained from the population estimate for the country. Food balance sheets tend to be affected by errors that arise in calculating production, waste, and consumption. They are not used to describe the nutritional inadequacies of any countries. They can be used to formulate the agricultural policies concerned with food production and consumption. Food balance sheets account of the annual production of the food, changes in stocks, imports, exports, and distribution of the food over various uses within the country. Food balance sheet does not provide and does not describe any data about the nutritional inadequacies of countries. Methods of assessing household food consumption. Consider the per capita food consumption of the household, taking into account the age and gender of the person in household, the number of meals eaten at home or away from income, shopping, and other factors. No record is made of food obtained outside the household food supply or of food wasted, spoilage, or fed to pets. The total number of food available for the consumption in the household. It only tells us about the total amount of food available for the consumption in the household, excluding the food eaten away from the home, useless, taken from the home. A variety of methods are available for estimating the dietary intakes. Diet history, 24 hours dietary record, food record, food frequency questionnaire. None of the method is perfect. All methods have strong points, weak points, advantages, and disadvantages. Dietary records are appropriate for assessing the intakes of groups of people, but a single 24-hour record may not give an adequate picture of the specific individual usual intake. Food records are considered the best method of assessing the dietary intake, but they are time consuming and the result may not be accurate. If subjects modify their eating habits during the time of the study, diet histories can provide the detailed information, but they require the subjects to make judgments about their usual food habits. Food frequency questionnaires provide less detailed information, but they are well suited for use with large groups. These questionnaires should include all important population-specific food sources of the nutrients. Science of epidemiology may seem far removed from the job responsibilities of the community nutritionist, but in fact it is absolutely essential to the delivery of the effective nutrition programs and services. Key roles of the community nutritionist include the identifying nutritional problems within the community and interpreting the scientific literature, especially experimental, clinical, and epidemiologic nutrition research findings for the public and other health professions. Community nutritionists must be able to critically evaluate the scientific literature before formulating new nutrition policies or offering the advice about the eating patterns. Even if you are not involved as a community nutritionist in collecting or analyzing the research data, interpretation and application of research findings are key responsibilities of any registered dietitian nutrition. Imagine you are tasked with writing a policy brief on dietary fat consumption for your local Department of Health. What type of data would you need to make this recommendation? Where would you go to find the data? Search the answer and tell me tomorrow. I repeat my question. Imagine you are tasked with writing a policy brief on dietary fat consumption for your local Department of Health. What types of data would you need to make this recommendation? And where would you go to find